World History of Christianity, Chapter 11, Part 3, page 443. The Social Gospel. The challenges of the end of the 19th century were not all on the individual or intellectual levels. By this period, there was an increased awareness that urbanization and industrialization were changing the face of America in troubling ways. Religious leaders lamented the violent clashes which characterized labor disputes, as well as a perceived loss of civic virtue. In the new social order, it came to be argued Christianity must take the lead. This was the background to the social gospel movement. On one level, it was neither unique to the end of the 19th century nor unique to America. Since the days of the apostles, Christians had recognized that there was a social dimension to their gospel. But the social gospel movement was dependent upon presuppositions drawn from both late 19th century theological liberalism and a number of uniquely American emphases. From theological liberalism, proponents of the social gospel drew their confidence in the possibility of rational reform, their emphasis on the latent perfectibility of human nature, and their belief that the core of the gospel was the ethical message of Jesus. From the American Protestant tradition, they drew upon the popular spirit of post-millennialism and the belief that through human labor the kingdom of God might be achieved. Hence, unlike many European Christian social critics who attacked modern industrial society from the perspective of an idealized Christian past, American proponents of the social gospel looked to the imminent coming of the kingdom. The movement offered both practical criticism of American society and a vision of the true Christian life. Its proponents attacked the overly competitive nature of American economics, advocated cooperation between capital and labor, and called for increased governmental involvement in maintaining a just and proper way of life. The theological elements of the movement can be seen in its most famous representative, Walter Rauschenbusch, 1861 through 1918. Rauschenbusch was the premier theologian of the kingdom of God. The fruits of the kingdom would be a social redemption that would complement spiritual redemption. As he explained, the coming of the kingdom will be the regeneration of the superpersonal life of the race and will work out a social expression of what was contained in the personality of Christ. Social redemption would be marked by the triumph of cooperation over competition, fraternity over coercion, and public good over private gain. The social gospel movement was controversial. Its challenge to the social and political order upset economic conservatives, just as its reconceptualization of the gospel troubled religious conservatives. As much as the issue of the higher biblical criticism, it served to exacerbate liberal conservative tensions. If there were forces pulling American Protestants apart, there were other forces knitting them more closely together. The end of the 19th century witnessed a number of these pan-Protestant undertakings, perhaps none more important than the foreign missionary movement. North American enthusiasm for missions was so great that by the early 20th century, over a third of the Protestant missionaries and over 40% of the mission's financial support came from there. The student volunteer movement for foreign missions, founded in 1886, became a popular symbol of both missionary enthusiasm and pan-Protestant unity. Through groups such as this and the Foreign Missions Conference of North America, founded in 1893, and through the influence of individuals like John R. Mott, 1865 through 1955, head of the student volunteer movement, a vision of a unified and expanding Christianity was set forth. The concern for unity resulted in the founding of the Federal Council of Churches in 1908, which provided a unified Protestant voice on many of the social issues of the day. Canada. Organization and Union. During these years, Canada also underwent great changes. In 1867, the Dominion of Canada was established and national life was formalized. These social changes shaped religious developments. Canadian church leaders saw Confederation as an opportunity for further Christianizing the nation and spoke of the new state as his dominion. At the same time, Canadians also grappled with many of the same social and intellectual changes as their southern neighbors, though usually with more moderation and restraint. By the time of Confederation, the denominational pattern was firmly established among Canadian churches. The selling of the clergy reserves in 1854 symbolized the end of the earlier attempt to maintain a special status for Canadian Anglicans. All church hereafter would be on a largely equal footing. This factor, coupled with the lessening of British support in the years after Confederation, resulted in a large-scale concern for national organization. The major Protestant groups, the Methodists, Presbyterians, Anglicans, and Baptists, all scurried to tie together their far-flung communities. Even Roman Catholics, though still centered in Quebec, had large and often English-speaking communities elsewhere. By the century's end, this endeavor at organization was largely accomplished. Like Americans, Canadians confronted the issues of science, biblical criticism, and social Christianity. What is distinctive about the Canadian story, however, is that these debates did not provoke the discord that they did in America. Canadian Protestants, on the whole, were able to maintain a mediating evangelicalism that was respectful both of tradition and of the new concerns. One sees this in career of the Methodist Nathaniel Burwash, 1839 through 1916, professor of natural theology at the Methodist Victoria College. Burwash combined a traditional Methodist interest in the experience of regeneration and a personal morality with a tentative openness to the new Darwinian science and higher criticism. Likewise, Canadians were greatly attracted to the growing concern for the social message of Christianity, and were particularly concerned with attempting to continue to make a Christian presence felt in the industrial cities. Protestants were particularly successful in maintaining the public reverencing of the first day of the week, and the 1906 Lord's Day Act was a fruit of this concern to combine both traditional ideas about Sabbath observance with the new concerns for the rights of workers. In one area, Canadian Protestants were more successful than their American counterparts, and that was concerning church union. The possibility of a united Protestant church was frequently mooted in the late 19th century Anglo-American world, and these discussions bore fruit in Canada. Inspired by works such as The Church Idea by the American Episcopalian William R. Huntington, many Canadians broached the possibility of church union. While Anglicans and Baptists ultimately demurred, the idea took root elsewhere. In 1902, William Patrick, 1852 through 1911, a Presbyterian fraternal delegate to the Methodist General Conference, proposed union between their two denominations. Methodists responded as later did the Congregationalists. During the early 20th century, representatives of these three denominations hammered out a basis for union. The eventual compromise attempted on the level of theology to balance a mild Presbyterian Calvinism with a mild Methodist Arminianism, and on the level of ecclesiology, it attempted to balance the different traditions of ministry. In 1910, the Congregationalists accepted the basis of union, and in the next year, the Methodists did so as well. Presbyterians, however, had more difficulties, and a significant minority balked at the plan. Many of these were of Scottish origin, for whom Presbyterianism was not simply a set of religious beliefs, but also a crucial part of their ethnic self-identity. Presbyterians postponed their decision, and the outbreak of the First World War put the question of church union off even more. The Presbyterian discussion was not renewed until 1920, with a final decision being made in 1925. Approximately 2/3 of Canadian Presbyterians decided to enter into the United Church of Canada, while a third refused. Challenges for the soul of America. The era of the First World War was a watershed in North American culture. It was also a key turning point in the story of Christianity. America entered the war an inward-looking, idealistic nation, confident in its values which were rooted in Victorian culture and the inherited Protestant faith. Indeed, despite an increasing social pluralism, the preeminence of the Protestant heritage was still largely unchallenged. Politicians freely used biblical imagery in their speeches, and rallies often ended with the singing of onward Christian soldiers. America carried these confidences into the war. After years of indecision, when the nation finally entered the conflict, it did so on quasi-religious terms. As President Woodrow Wilson, himself the child of a Presbyterian manse, explained, it would be the war to end all wars. The aftermath of the war, with the victorious nations greedily dividing the spoils, proved disillusioning. Even more disheartening were two other factors. The war radically displayed the gap between the traditional American Protestant perception of their society and the reality. The war years showed America to be far more pluralistic and secular than Protestants had heretofore imagined. Secondly, the war catalyzed the existing divisions between conservative and liberal Protestants and began a period of acrid controversy. American Protestants had always recognized that there were others in their country, but for many, particularly small-town Americans, there was a soothing solidarity everywhere the eye could see. One might recognize that there were large urban areas with mixed populations, but these did not seem like real America. However, the war experience showed an America far more complex. Indeed, the census of 1920, for the first time recorded more persons living in urban areas than rural. Furthermore, the new modes of communication, such as radio and moving pictures, made rural America aware not only that urban America existed, but that its cultural and moral presuppositions, particularly concerning sexuality, were at odds with the countryside. Since the cities were seen as the locations of both immigrants and an emerging crisis of morality, they were often lumped together. One reaction to this threat was the passage of Prohibition in 1919, abolishing the manufacture and sale of alcoholic beverages. As we have seen, the campaign against alcohol was a long-standing element of Protestant reform. By the late 19th century, it was also taken up by many political reformers who saw in the institution of the saloon a source of political corruption. Alcohol poisoned both the body human and the body politic, and its eradication would allow the forces of morality to reassert themselves over the larger society. Canadian Protestants also helped pass prohibition laws in the various Canadian provinces during the war, but afterwards they were repealed. The prohibition campaigns often pitted native Protestants against the new immigrants. Still another reaction to the crisis of the city was a turning off of the spigot of immigration, a series of immigration laws, culminating in the National Origins Act of 1924, set up annual quotas based upon the profile of the American population in 1890. These quotas not only ensured a drastically reduced number of immigrants, but that the bulk would be from the more Protestant Northern Europe, rather than from Central or Southern Europe. These formal actions were coupled with each other more nasty turns of nativism, ranging from quotas at elite colleges and universities to keep out the new immigrants, to the emergence of the Ku Klux Klan designed to protect, quote, 100% Americanism, unquote. All of these actions can be seen as attempts by English-speaking Protestants to maintain the traditional patterns of the society. The issues of urbanization, immigration, and alcohol came to a head in the presidential campaign of 1928. In that year, the Democratic Party chose New York Governor Al Smith for its nominee. Smith was an Irish Catholic from New York City and a notorious critic of prohibition. He was in some sense the native Protestant's nightmare. Although he was defeated in the general election, his candidacy was a sign of how the nation was changing and how the days of the Protestant hegemony were numbered. Meanwhile, the post-war era saw an intensifying of the conservative-liberal divide within Protestantism. As we have seen, a long-standing question of American Christianity had been that of adaptation, or to what degree older understandings and practices could be modified to respond to new cultural settings. If during the first half of the 19th century the cultural setting facing Protestants had been democratic populism, by the end of the century it had become the new intellectual milieu characterized by the questions of science and history. Since the 1880s, some American Protestants had been engaged in modifying aspects of the inherited faith, particularly in their views on divine intervention in the world. Yet these liberalizers were always a minority, and the further one moved from instructions of learning and power, the more scarce they appeared. The perceived crisis of the post-war world, manifested in everything from radical politics to short skirts, convinced many conservatives that American was failing because it had jettisoned its traditional biblical heritage. It had done so because the leaders of the great Protestant churches, stewards of this heritage, had let it slip away. This reaction became known as fundamentalism, the belief that true Christianity was marked by a number of basic or fundamental beliefs. The inerrancy of Scripture, the miraculous birth and resurrection of Jesus and his sacrificial death were all considered essential to true Christianity. Those who could not affirm them should be excluded from the churches. The fundamentalist liberal debate involved two very different visions of the nature of the true church. Fundamentalists offered a combative vision reflecting a strict doctrinal orthodoxy, while liberals suggested an inclusivist vision. Fundamentalists such as the Presbyterian J. Gresham Machen, 1881 through 1937, argued that no compromise could be made between biblical Christianity and liberalism. In contrast, liberals such as Harry Emerson Fosdick, 1878 through 1979, called for toleration and discussion. The controversy affected large sections of American and Canadian Protestantism, but the two communities in which the battle raged most intensely were Northern Presbyterians and Baptists. In the South, however, the fundamentalist controversy took a different form. By the 1920s, the American South was beginning to emerge from its largely self-imposed isolation stemming from its defeat in the Civil War. The era of the First World War had brought the South far more in touch with larger national concerns. Southern fundamentalists shared with their Northern co-religionists the sense of crisis, but for them the focus of the crisis was not liberalism, but the theory of evolution. Evolution was seen as undergirding a naturalistic worldview and undermining the idea of a Christian democracy. If the book of Genesis offered the foundational principle of democracy, that all citizens were endowed with the image of God, evolution justified theories of elitism, such as Friedrich Nietzsche's Superman. Significantly, the great champion against the teaching of evolution was both a Presbyterian layman and a populist politician, the perennial presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan. Throughout the early 1920s, a number of Southern state legislatures began to pass legislation banning the teaching of evolution in public schools. It was the Tennessee law that was challenged in the infamous Scopes trial of 1925. There, in rural Tennessee, before the press in full force, the trial took place. It seemed to manifest the intellectual limitations of fundamentalism and associated the movement for many with rural and anti-intellectual themes. As a result, the fundamentalist campaign collapsed. Rather than forcing out the liberals, fundamentalists themselves began abandoning the historic Protestant denominations. This denouement, however, was tinged with irony. Fundamentalism did not disappear, but retreated to separatist communities. There, it licked its wounds and prepared for its next clash with liberal Protestantism. Let the church be the church. In 1929, with the great stock market crash, North America, like the rest of the world, entered into the Great Depression, which affected North American Christians both socially and psychologically. On the social level, the economic collapse threatened church institutions from local to national. If the loss of revenues was a tangible blow, North American Protestants were perhaps even more profoundly affected by the psychological blow. Many Canadian and American Protestants had viewed their societies as distinctive contributions to the idea of Christian civilization. The cultural values of progress, uplift, cooperation, and rationality were assumed to be part of a proper Christian worldview. The social and economic collapse caused many to re-examine these presuppositions. As one chastened cleric admitted, our conception of God is that he is sort of a magnificent Rotarian. Sometimes, indeed, one wonders whether the social movement and the uplift in general have not become among Protestants a substitute for devotion. Worse than that, a substitute for real religion. The social and economic crisis made words like uplift and progress ring hollow. The economic crisis provoked radical social nostrums from left and right. From the left, individuals such as the Methodist Harry F. Ward urged the churches to reject capitalism outright and to move in the direction of communism. Others, such as the Fellowship of Socialist Christians, advocated a fundamental reformation of American society. From the right, figures like the Disciples of Christ minister Gerald L.K. Smith espoused nativism and vigorous anti-communism. Still others, such as the Catholic priest and radio broadcaster Charles Coughlin, combined attacks upon bankers, politicians, and international conspirators. In a class by himself was the Canadian William Aberhart, 1878 through 1943, radio preacher and premier of Alberta, who combined fundamentalism and monetarist reform. The decade of the 1930s saw increased visibility for American Catholics. The election of Franklin D. Roosevelt to the presidency in 1932 brought to national prominence not only Catholic politicians, but also Catholic ideas. Inspired by medieval ideas of the just wage, Catholics like John A. Ryan, 1869 through 1945, had long advocated the idea of a living wage, or the setting of labor costs on the basis of justice rather than upon market conditions. This was institutionalized in minimum wage legislation. Other Catholics, emboldened by papal pronouncements like Quadragesimo Anno, advocated the rights of labor and the view of a corporate state that would transcend the alternatives of both capitalism and communism. Still others, like Dorothy Day, 1897 through 1980, and the Catholic worker movement, emphasized solidarity with the poor and a radical social vision. Yet the prestige of Catholicism during these years was not limited to its social teachings. The 1930s saw perhaps the fullest flowering of Neo-Thomism, the revival of the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, with its emphasis upon the integration of reason and revelation. The assertion that Catholicism offered an alternative to both American capitalism and culture-bound Protestantism attracted many to the Church of Rome. Themes of social and intellectual crisis were likewise taken up by advocates of Protestant neo-orthodoxy, having its roots in post-First World War Europe, particularly in the insights of the Swiss theologian Karl Barth. Neo-orthodoxy strove to reclaim basic Christian themes while addressing the modern human predicament. Neo-Orthodox writers such as Reinhold Niebuhr, 1892 through 1971, and H. Richard Niebuhr, 1894 through 1962, criticized American Protestantism for both its social thinking and its theology. Both reflected 19th century cultural idealism more than the world of the Bible. American Protestants had all too often viewed the world through rose-colored glasses, believing that cooperation, human effort, and reform could bring about the kingdom of God. In contrast, Neo-Orthodox writers emphasized the hard reality of sin and selfishness that polluted human endeavors and kept justice at bay. Likewise, in their view of the human predicament, they returned to the biblical categories of sin and grace, which earlier liberals had seemed to de-emphasize in favor of ideas of uplift and nurture. 19th century American Protestantism had attempted to model itself after the patterns of the world, but now the world was bankrupt. One of the neo-Orthodox watchwords became, "Let the church be the church." Although open to ideas of modern science and history, writers like Reinhold Niebuhr saw the modern world as tragically confirming the biblical view of human nature as marked by sin, rather than giving any view of the latent perfectibility of humanity. Neo-Orthodoxy might have been only an academic movement if it had not been for the impact of the Second World War. As the secret history of the First World War, the war to end all wars, came to be learned, it appeared that it had been fought more to make the world safe for those American banks that had lent huge sums to the Allies than for any lofty purpose. Disillusion convinced many leading American Protestants to renounce warfare altogether. Even in the face of the rise of Adolf Hitler and Nazism, many, if not a majority, of leading Protestants supported a policy of pacifism. One who did not was Reinhold Niebuhr. A realistic view of the world, he argued, showed that injustice had to be met with force. While the peace which Christ promised could only be brought about by prayer, that did not imply pacifism, a refusal to resist evil and injustice. Niebuhr's view of social responsibility took on great importance as America entered the Second World War. With it, the neo-Orthodox view of the world and human nature as broken and sinful, and emphasis upon individuals as responsible moral agents, gained in attractiveness. The strains felt during the post-1945 Cold War added to the popularity of neo-Orthodoxy, and for 2 decades it reigned as the preeminent theology and social philosophy of American Protestants. The neo-Orthodox revitalization of intellectual Protestantism can further be seen in the heightened status of institutions such as Union Theological Seminary, New York, and Yale Divinity School. In the post-war decades, they emerged as important centers of international Protestantism. The post-war revival. America's entrance into the war also inaugurated a revival of interest in religion. This revival gained speed in the post-war decades, and the post-war revival represented a high water mark of public religiosity in American history. By 1960, 69% of Americans were associated with a religious community. Furthermore, in 1957, 96% of Americans surveyed identified themselves as either Christian or Jewish. The post-war revival, however, was unlike other revivals in American history. Even during its heyday, commentators noted that it was inspired by a number of non-traditional factors, one being a surge in anti-communism. The tensions of the Cold War, in which Americans saw themselves as pitted against a godless communism, convinced many that patriotism and religion were intricately interconnected. Religion was a necessary bulwark against communism, both at home and abroad. A second factor in the growth of religious identification were demographic changes in American society. The post-war era was a time of burgeoning suburbanization, and in these new suburbs, churches were key institutions for socialization. Furthermore, as the sociologist Will Herberg noted, suburban church identification was one of the few socially acceptable ways for new suburbanites to maintain a degree of ethnic self-identity that had been so important in the cities which they left. Finally, the post-war revival benefited from a strong social interest in peace of mind. A therapeutic rather than reformist element became a defining aspect of public religiosity, and works like Norman Vincent Peale's The Power of Positive Thinking, 1952, which emphasized the practical value of religion for successful living, proved enormously popular. Still another factor behind the post-war revival was the resurgence of conservative evangelicalism. After a decade of retrenchment, conservative Protestants re-entered the public scene in the 1940s. The National Association of Evangelicals was founded in 1942 as a voice for conservative evangelicalism. By the end of that decade, writers such as Carl F. H. Henry and Edward J. Carnell began articulating a self-conscious neo-evangelicalism that attempted to separate from the central evangelical emphases of conversion-oriented piety and biblicalism some of the cultural quirks of earlier fundamentalism. The movement of neo-evangelicalism would be most popularized by its leading figure, the evangelist Billy Graham, through whom the revivalist message of conservative Protestantism again began to compete for the loyalty of the American religious public. At first glance, American Christianity seemed stronger than ever. On the international scene, it was taking the lead in institutions like the World Council of Churches, which met in Evanston, Illinois in 1954, and on the local scene, it seemed to be growing everywhere. Critics, however, observed that the swelling churches were in a peculiar position. Sunday school and Sunday morning attendance were surging, while other services, such as Wednesday evening prayer services, were withering. Likewise, as a professed loyalty to the Bible was advancing, the actual knowledge of its content was embarrassingly slight. The religious revival rested upon the shallowest of foundations. It was often more a revival of faith in faith than of the historic faith itself. The traditional cultural loyalties that had bound people to religion were being torn asunder by demographic changes, and the slightest tremor might upset the edifice of the religious revival. The 1960s and the Second Disestablishment. The events of the turbulent decade of the 19th centuries proved more than a tremor. Rather, they were a profound eruption that transformed the religious landscape. Even from a distance of 30 years, it is hard to have a full picture of the effects of this decade upon the lives of American and Canadian Christians. But its impact was to be felt in at least 4 different areas. First, the decade witnessed the final collapse of the Protestant hegemony in America. It began with the election of John F. Kennedy to the presidency of the United States as the first Catholic president. Kennedy's election may also be seen as a symbol of the coming of age of the American Catholic community. Demographic changes such as suburbanization and upward economic mobility were largely removing many of the social barriers that had long divided Protestant and Catholic Americans, and given to the latter their sense of minority status. Second, there occurred a radicalization of the concept of the separation of church and state. For 19th century figures such as Joseph Story, the First Amendment primarily served to prevent an established church. Courts had not held that the government be disengaged from or neutral regarding religion. Many 20th century legal commentators argued that such a neutrality and even total separation was the true meaning of the amendment. In the 1960s, in a series of Supreme Court decisions, both formal prayer and devotional Bible reading were banned from the public schools. Subsequent cases have treated the permissibility of prayer at other public gatherings and the permissibility of displaying religious symbols on public property. Third, the idea that America had a special religious mission came increasingly under attack. As has been shown, from very early on, religion and nationalism were interconnected in the American experience, and Americans often understood themselves as a city upon a hill. Such religious imagery, always more ideal than real, fell especially short in race relations. During the 1960s, a great campaign for the full civil rights of African Americans arose to make good such ideals. At first, the message of individuals like Martin Luther King Jr., 1929 through 68, combined biblical themes and appeals to American traditions of justice, and the campaign attracted the active support of many clergy. But by the late 1960s, social critics in the movement were both more critical and pessimistic of American society and questions of race. At the same time, opponents of the war in Vietnam faulted America for its imperialism and presumption. These criticisms badly damaged the heretofore accepted notion of America as a shining city on a hill. It was seen as more sickly than shining. Accordingly, prophetic denunciation rather than patriotic celebration seemed to be the proper religious response. Finally, these years also saw many Americans begin to call into question a number of cultural and ethical assumptions. On questions of sex and gender, society was faulted for its traditional view that certain sexual orientations and certain models of gender relationship were natural. Other issues concerned the lack of respect for the environment. In all of these areas, major challenges were presented to the traditional Christian communities. How to respond to these challenges became a pressing concern, and since the 1960s, the North American Christian communities have been increasingly divided. On the whole, the older English-speaking Protestant communities, such as the Methodists, Presbyterians, Northern Baptists, and Episcopalians, began haltingly to come to grips with the Revolution. In liturgical revisions, in moral teachings, and in social statements, the influence of the Revolution of the 1960s began to be felt. Perhaps most dramatically, the impact was seen in questions of gender. The ordination of women to the varying levels of ministry was largely accepted by the late 1970s. Other questions, such as the use of inclusive language and the questioning of the metaphor of the fatherhood of God, have been more controversial. The Cultural Revolution, furthermore, transformed the attitudes of many Christians to the Native American community. From the 17th century, North American Christians had usually assumed that evangelization and westernization went hand in hand. The new perspective of the 1960s not only led to a rejection of this presupposition, but also a new positive appreciation of the religious heritage of Native Americans themselves. Particularly on questions of spirituality and respect for nature, the European American community realized it had much to learn from its Native American neighbors. The questions of the 1960s left their mark on the older Protestant denominations in one other way. Since the early 1960s, there has been a significant loss in membership here, and in the 3 decades after 1965, they have all lost between 1/6 and 1/3 of their members. No religious community, however, was more affected by the turmoil of the 1960s than was Roman Catholicism. Before the 1960s, Catholics in both America and Canada had the reputation for conservatism, docility, and loyalty to Rome. Yet, as has been suggested, during the post-war years, the Catholic community underwent a profound demographic revolution. Upward social and economic mobility and suburbanization created a very different Catholic laity, one in which the traditional moorings of a tightly knit Catholic culture were being eroded. In this context, the aggiornamento, an opening of windows, of the Second Vatican Council was followed with enthusiasm by North American Catholics. The teachings of Vatican II delighted, puzzled, and frustrated these individuals. They applauded the Declaration on Religious Liberty, which affirmed the American experience of freedom and conscience, and owed much to an American Jesuit, Courtney Murray. Likewise, most American and Canadian Catholics responded favorably to the decree on ecumenism, which allowed a freer interchange between Catholics and their non-Catholic neighbors. Other changes seemed more puzzling. Changes in liturgy, devotional practices, and such long-standing marks of social identification as the Friday fast seemed to upset traditional assumptions and practices. Finally, many Catholics were frustrated at the halting nature of the changes. Nowhere was this more expressed than in the reaction to the papal pronouncement affirming the traditional rejection of birth control, Humanae Vitae, 1968. Despite the pronouncement, polls indicated that the papal view was rejected or ignored by large numbers of American Catholics. Perhaps the crisis of North American Catholicism was as much an effect of time warp as anything else, as Catholics began wrestling with a whole variety of questions that other Christians had been confronting for a century, but the effect was great. One symbol was the decline in priestly vocations. In the 2 decades after Vatican II, the number of seminarians in the United States dropped by 75%, and 241 seminaries were forced to close. If the 1960s had a dramatic effect on American Catholics, they were to have an even greater effect on French-speaking Canadian Catholics. For nearly 300 years, Quebec had viewed itself as a society held together by its Catholicism. The role of the Catholic Church in shaping education and morals was legendary, as was the loyalty of Quebecois to the Church. In the late 1950s, 93% of Quebecois attended weekly Mass. But the patterns of urbanization and dislocation weakened the traditions of the society. In 1960, Quebec labor unions broke their ties with the Catholic Church, and by 1964, the Catholic dominion over education was also challenged. All of this has been referred to as the Quiet Revolution, in which the place of the Catholic Church in French-speaking Canada was largely transformed. Increasingly, Francophone culture and not Catholicism became the badge of identification. One result of this quiet revolution has been that weekly Mass attendance plummeted from 93% to 30% in 30 years. The decades after the 1960s have finally witnessed a remarkable growth in the movements of conservative evangelicalism, where themes of biblical inerrancy and conversion-oriented piety continue to find a hearing. Both in numbers and influence, these churches began to challenge the traditional status of the older Protestant denominations. Particularly fast-growing have been the Pentecostal churches, such as the Assemblies of God. By the end of the 1980s, evangelical Protestant churches equaled in size the older mainline churches. These churches, on the whole, have rejected the revolution of the 1960s on questions such as sexuality, gender roles, and civil religion. The post-1960s revival of conservative Protestantism has also involved a political dimension, and many of these individuals, through movements like the Moral Majority or Christian Coalition, have attempted to shape public policy. Christianity in North America at the end of the 20th century. As the century comes to an end, the story of Christianity in North America shows signs of both continuity and discontinuity. In America, 43% of Christians still attend church weekly. Although this is below the unusually high levels of the post-war revival, it is approximately the average of most decades in the 20th century. The story in Canada is a bit different. In 1940, Canadians were more likely than Americans to attend church, while by 1980, this pattern had reversed. But whether this shift marks a fundamental change in religious life is difficult to determine. In both nations, people baptize children, support churches, and perform religious duties in large numbers. But there are signs of discontinuity as well. The new challenges have in many ways polarized North American Christians into conservative and liberal camps. Indeed, the conservative-liberal split has become more profound than earlier. Because the issues have become largely cultural, the division has transcended the customary dividing lines of Protestantism and Catholicism, and the conservative-liberal split has largely replaced the earlier Catholic-Protestant divide that for so long characterized North American Christianity. By century's end, on issues of theology, morality, and social policy, liberals and conservatives within both Protestantism and Catholicism often find more in common with their ideological soulmates than with their co-religionists. As these divisions have spilled forth into the political arena, and as issues of abortion, gender roles, and homosexuality have become a regular part of American political debates, Christians both from the left and right have become more politically active. Finally, the notion of an unofficial establishment of religion that had played such an important role in the story of Christianity in North America has been largely abandoned. As one Canadian historian has observed, by the 1960s, Canadian Christians were forced to recognize a situation in which churches were no longer moral policemen, but pressure groups or even interest groups. This recognition of a new role for Christianity in society, no longer as official leaders, but as witnesses, has been perhaps the greatest transformation within North American Christianity in the last decades of the 20th century. This ends chapter 11.